My long-winded title is Lots of Plants Are Edible, Not All Plants Are Tasty. So here's a guide to foraging that's worth your time because I've tasted a lot of them. And these ones are my favorite because I only have a limited amount of time to talk to you about the bounty of the earth. My name's Moss. I use they, them pronouns. And I fell in love with foraging because I started to identify the weeds that were in the farm at OSU. And as I was learning about these weeds and just being able to understand how to control them, get the crops that I wanted to grow, I also learned that so many of them were edible and so many of them were as tasty, if not tastier, than the things that we were actually working to produce. And they grow wild everywhere. And as somebody who just loves to cook, as somebody who loves to explore new foods and everything, I get really excited about the foods that the earth has to offer us. Okay. So this is going to be a very practical guide to foraging, and I want to do some due diligence to make sure that y'all don't go out and harm yourselves when you're doing this. Foraging, I think, is safer than a lot of people make it out to be in their minds, but we're going to talk about how to make sure that you're extra safe. So before you go, do you have water with you? Are you wearing sunscreen? For real? Are you actually wearing sunscreen? Do you have some with you to reapply as you're out there? You might want to have a knife. Sometimes that's helpful to harvest things. You want to make sure that you have a bag that's suitable to what you're trying to gather. And then last but not least, this is the most important thing, you need to have an idea of what you're looking for. So here's a little anecdote. When I was, first learning how to identify plants, I was convinced that everything was edible. Every single plant I looked up, it's that's an edible plant, that's an edible plant, that's an edible plant. And so I was all plants are edible. And so I found this plant that's really beautiful. It was Coreopsis, and the leaves of it smell like dill when you crush them up. And I was like, you must be able to eat this. It smells delicious. It must be delicious. And it was delicious. It was also poisonous. And what's really sad about that is if I had taken the time to actually identify what Coreopsis was, I would learn that it is, once again, an edible plant. You just can only eat the flowers. The leaves are poisonous, but the flowers are not. And so this brings me to good and bad foraging methods. So a not so safe way to forage is to go out and about, find a plant as you're in the field, identify it in the field, learn about its edibility for the first time, and then eat it there. That's not gonna reliably get you safe foods to eat. A better way is to understand what it is that you're going out and looking for, or at the bare minimum, understand what is in season right now. Because a lot of things that have poisonous lookalikes, poisonous dupes, those mature in different parts of the season than maybe what you're looking for. And so just understanding seasonality and different plant stages is a really good way to make sure that you are going in with some intention and therefore a little bit of a safety blanket. It also informs where you go. So I just have two different landscapes. These are just stock images. But on this, what is it for y'all? This left image, you might be able to find plantain, you might be able to find chickweed, you might be able to find oxalis out and about. We'll talk about them. And those are all great, wonderful, wild, edible foods. But if you went looking for that in a very moist, forested environment, you wouldn't have very good luck. But in that moist, foresty environment, you might have better luck finding mushrooms because you're not going to find that many out in an open field space, except maybe a puffball. In which case, you should call me because I want one. Okay, so most things in the Midwest are not trying to kill you when you go out into the woods, but some of them are going to try and give you contact dermatitis, which is just a rash. So these are species of the toxicodendrons, toxico meaning toxic, dendron meaning tree, though they are not trees. They produce an allergen, I don't know how to pronounce it, urushiol, but it can make you itchy, and it is what is in poison ivy. And I don't think that a lot of us were really properly taught how to identify these different poisonous plants, so we're just gonna walk through it a little bit. So poison ivy, it has the leaves of three. Leaves of three is not a be-all, end-all. There are plenty of tasty plants that have leaves of three. So the way that I think about poison ivy is that poison ivy has these thumbs. So if you look on these outside plants, so the outside leaves of the leaves of three have one thumb that is facing away from this central plant. So thumb that's facing away, thumb that's facing away, central leaf, two thumbs. So that's the way that you can tell on the forest floor. It will have the leaves of three, but it'll also have the little edge. And I think that's the best way to identify poison ivy. Poison ivy is also not an ivy, fun fact. And then we have poison oak. also not an oak, but it is called this because its leaves resemble white oak. It also has the leaves of 3, but it's not as common here in the Midwest. It tends to be more common down in the South or out west. Okay, and then we're finally going to talk about something that you can eat, and that is staghorn sumac. Staghorn sumac is a delicious cluster of berries that is on the staghorn sumac tree, and it's very lemony and citrusy and beautiful. It is this bottom picture here. But sumac trees, I thought they all were safe because there was this beautiful edible one, and then I was touching up on one that I was like, oh look, a beautiful sumac tree, and learned about the existence of poison sumac, which is Toxicodendron vernix. It's actually a sumac, unlike our other poisonous lookalikes, but it's more closely related to poison ivy and poison oak than it is to the other sumacs. The way that you can tell these apart is that the poison variety has these smooth leaves, wherein the staghorn sumac has serrated leaves. And when I say smooth, I mean that it does not have serrations. Sometimes in the botany word they call that entire. I do not mean smooth as in you should feel the texture of the leaf in order to identify it. It usually has fewer leaflets than a staghorn sumac. That means around less than 13. Though the staghorn sumac can have as few as 9 leaflets, all the way up to 31. The twigs of poison sumac are hairless, whereas the staghorn sumac is hairier, and the berries, which you can kind of see if you squint, are down here. They're far separated from one another, and they tend to be green around this time of year, whereas if you were to see this tree right now, it would look a lot like this. And these berries are really clustered together, they're really fuzzy, and I have one for y'all to try if you want to try it. The other good news about this one, even though it has a poison looking like, you don't have to touch it until you're trying to harvest this specific thing, so there's no reason that you should be giving yourself any rashes. Okay, so the uses of staghorn sumac, it's a very cool plant. It has been in use for a very long time all across the Middle East and the Mediterranean. It's a very traditional spice used in the za'atar spice blend, but also just like a staple pantry ingredient. They dry it and they grind it, and it produces this really gorgeous, beautiful color that you can add to things. It has a very sour, citrusy taste, and you can steep it. So you can take this whole cluster here, and then you can soak it in water overnight, and you can make a gorgeous lemonade. I don't really like teas that much, so a lot of these are not like things that you just turn into tea. I like to dry it and grind it, and because of its acidity, it actually works as a really great meat tenderizer if you're using it in that kind of spice blend. It's also a great raw salad addition, though it has a pretty intense, like, bitey inner seed, so that would add a lot of texture to your salad. Use wisely. Now let's talk about acorns. I think acorns are worth talking about twice. They're wonderful and gorgeous. They're part of oaks, obviously. Quercus species. There are like hundreds of species of oaks, and all of them produce edible acorns. Asterisks. No acorns are edible unless you process them. So processing is leaching out the tannins. So tannins, in the words of Alexis Nicole, are a tummy no-no. And the way that we can leach them out is we just soak them in water. And it's a pretty labor-intensive process. Like, you have to empty the water every day, and then you have to dry it, and you grind it, and it's a whole thing. But it produces the most beautiful oaty flower that's just, it's so gorgeous. I brought some with today, if y'all want to sniff it, because it's just so wonderful. But Forager Chef, whose book I'm going to have up here later at the end of these slides, has a really great in-depth article on how to process all of this, and it's highly worth it. Oh, the last thing on this is that how long you have to soak your acorns, so how much work you're investing in up front, is based off whether or not you have a red oak or a white oak, which is two like very broad categories of oaks. And a lot of places will tell you like, oh, like red oaks have like pointy leaves and white oaks have like curved leaves. But given just how many oaks there are, I think that the best practice is identify what species of oak you have, work backwards, as opposed to just trying to find the category. And you can always leach for longer. All right. And then spruce tips. Spruce tips I learned about this year. They're so wonderful. From Picea abies is the Norway spruce, and this is the spruce that was in my parents' backyard, and also now is in my current backyard at my new place. So it must like me. And so a little secret of foragers is that actually most conifers have edible young tips, but this goes back to the first part of my presentation. Lots of things are edible, not all things are tasty. So you can try them, but a lot of them just have like a really, really intense astringency, which basically means after you're done eating it, your mouth just feels so dry. Versus the Norway spruce is one of those species that just has like a really gorgeous citrusy flavor. And I mean, if you can imagine what eating a spruce tree would taste like, it tastes a lot like that. It's truly delectable. I do have to do my due diligence again. There is a toxic pine tree. It is of the yew species, but those are more common out west. The genus of those is Taxus. So you want to harvest the youngest new growth, and that you'll see it, you'll be able to identify it because it's like bright green on the dark green background of the old growth from last year. And usually you want to try and get it while the papery husk is still on. It means that it just emerged, and so it's going to be at its most tender. I harvest them a little bit after the paper had come off, and they were still really gorgeous and chewy. I also have spruce tips with me today if you want to try them. They've been in the freezer. I haven't tasted them after thawing, but I think they'll still be good. And you can use this for a lot of things. I made ice cream down here. Forager Chef has a really great recipe for that. You can use it in sauces. It adds like a really bright citrusy note as a salad addition, but basically anything that's a cold preparation because it loses a lot of its flavor once you heat it up. And then the last thing I'll say about this is that for sustainable harvesting, you don't want to harvest the tip that's at the very end of the branch, the apical tip, because once you take that off, you're essentially pruning the tree, and so it's not going to grow in that direction again. So if you harvest a bunch of the ends, you could potentially like stunt this tree's growth. So you want to find where there's like a cluster of 5 and take like 1 or 2 and then move around. But it has so many spruce tips at the beginning of each season. So it can be hard to like gather too many. They say that a good rule of thumb is like no more than 20% of the tree, but it's one of those things where it's like, good luck to get to 20%. That said, be mindful. Okay, pawpaws. I am gonna go off about pawpaws because I love them so much. So pawpaws are the reason that I came back to the Midwest. Not really, but like 90% of it. They grow down in Georgia. They have a really long range. They're the highest north tropical fruit that there is in North America. And they're so wonderful and delectable. And there's a lot of pawpaw trees down south, but not a lot of pawpaws. They don't pollinate very well. They don't grow very well. And here, I just feel like walking through the forest is just a gift of abundance and blessings from the earth. It's so wonderful. You have to know about this tree in order to live in Ohio. It's required. So go read up about it. And it's in the hickory family. The way that you can tell it apart from a lot of other common hickory trees is that the edges of it are smooth, and most hickory trees have serrated edges. But you'll also always be able to tell because you can see the little pawpaws. And around like May, early June, you can start to see the fingies of the pawpaw, and they're usually little clusters of 5. And it's just a really fun game to look and see like, oh, I found a pawpaw tree, and then look up and try and see where all the pawpaws are going to be coming in and mark your spots. They tend to ripen around like September, which is also the time of the annual Ohio Pawpaw Festival, which I highly recommend checking out. It's a really great space to go meet other people who are as excited about this wonderful wild fruit as you are, and they usually have a lot of really great talks and speakers and vendors and stuff like that. And you can get yourself some pawpaws. And I think it's going to be in Albany, Ohio this year, but definitely worth checking out. They're on Facebook. Okay, so service berries, also worth mentioning again. So there's actually like 20 species of this tree, and a lot of them, there are like more wild ones and there are more domesticated and cultivated ones. It's a pretty short tree. It's very common in landscaping around Columbus. If you walk along High Street in like Clintonville, Old North area, you are going to run into a serviceberry tree. So like keep your eyes peeled. And those just end up all falling on the ground. I first learned about serviceberry because I saw this really funky looking berry on the tree and I was like, what is that? This is a rusty berry. It has a Kint's rust disease on it. But then I learned about all the other beautiful berries that were on that tree. And so that's actually how I first started identifying it, is I would see this bright orange, but now I've trained my eye more to be able to look for this like really gorgeous berry. If you look really closely, the leaves are like slightly serrated, even though they don't really like look like it unless you're really close up. And the berries start off with this like kind of reddish purple, and then they darken to that like deep purple. And you want to get them when they're at the deep purple. Yeah. And then they're truly delectable. They have a texture of a blueberry. I mean, they kind of look like a blueberry, but they also have the texture of a blueberry, and the seeds are very almondy. So it's a real delight. Mulberries. This is our backyard. Somebody had planted a mulberry tree. I'm very grateful to them. Basically, the time that service berries are ready, you need to be looking out for mulberries, and vice versa. Mulberries look like blackberries. I have a little branch from a mulberry tree I just found in my backyard earlier today when I was picking grape leaves. And if you want to look at it up close, but it looks a lot different than these leaves because there are, once again, several species of mulberries. And they have serrated leaves. The ones I have these like really deep, funky looking lobes, but these ones are more traditional leaf shaped. And they're really great. This is a great one to find by just, you look at the sidewalk as you're walking, and then all of a sudden the sidewalk has turned purple. That's a great time to look up and just investigate what's going on. Okay, so, I didn't tell y'all what the order of this presentation was, but basically we're going from the top of the canopy, and then we're gonna work our way to the ground. So, grapes. Once again, there's a whole bunch of species of grapes. I tried to pick things that mostly don't have a lot of dangerous lookalikes and things like that. The genus is Vitis. But this is a 2-in-1 forageable, so all wild grapes are edible, and also all of the leaves. So if you've ever had, like pickled grape leaves to wrap some beautiful ricey things up, then that's what this is. And you can harvest them right now. They're growing literally everywhere. I have a bunch of grape leaves to look at if you're not very familiar with what grape leaves looks like, but you can tell because it's a vining plant and it has this like essentially traditional grape leaf look. It's very serrated, and you want to pick the ones that are like essentially the size of your hand. If they get too mature, they'll become too fibrous to really eat through, and if they're too young, they won't hold anything really well, you won't be able to wrap anything in it. They grow all over the place, but particularly in edges of places. So the edge of a forest, they tend to grow on fences. They're growing all along the fence in my backyard. And yet no grapes. I don't know what that's about, but lots of delicious grape leaves, and I'm grateful for that. So if you're looking to harvest the grapes, you want to be thinking about like late August. Some people wait all the way until there's a first frost, but you can also let them ripen inside. But for the leaves, you want to do like early summer when they're still young and they're still tender. Okay, next let's talk about brambles, another sweet love of mine. Brambles are part of the rose family, Rosaceae, and this generally refers to like a group of edible plants that have like blackberry, raspberry, dewberry, and sometimes they can be hard to identify which is which until the berries are actually present. But any lookalikes to brambles that are not kind of the blackberry, raspberry end up having a more rose-hip fruit at the end. And so you want to once you see an actual what looks like a blackberry, you're in the right zone and you can go ahead and taste. Sometimes brambles can have the same thumbs that we talked about earlier for poison ivy, but the way to tell is that every rose has its thorn. I promised them I would sing. If it has thorns, you are looking at a bramble and not at poison ivy. Okay, alliums, more like allium. So these are wild garlic, wild leek, wild all of it. Alliums is a huge range of species, but all parts of all alliums are edible, including these gorgeous purple flowers. I am not liable if you ruin someone's landscaping by harvesting these. You can take one. And then they're really delicious. It's a great addition to salad, but mostly you can harvest the stalk and chop them up, use them like you would chives, green onions. We all know how to use garlic. It's really just like a gorgeous blessing of a plant. They start popping up in spring, and you can usually find them like all throughout the summer. They're usually taller and they're darker than like your regular grass that you're finding, and their stems are hollow. I was walking around with my mom in her backyard, and I was showing her all the plants that were edible. I was like, look, you got some nettles, you got some garlic mustard, you should handle that. And you have like this mulberry tree, it's also great, And then she goes, hey, we have this like onion grass. And she picks up a bright green piece of grass and puts it in her mouth. And I was like, I do not think that is onion grass. And she's like, it was not. So that's how you know that you have the right thing, is it will taste oniony. And most grasses, if you give it something a little nibble and spit it out, you're gonna be okay. The worst you're gonna do is give yourself a stomachache. Okay, did I skip one? Okay, now let's talk about garlic mustard. Garlic mustard can be a little tricky because it does have a lot of lookalikes. A lot of times, like wild violet, though it's not serrated, can sometimes have the same shape. A lot of leaves have this very distinct round and then divot shape. So for example, this is purple dead nettle, and it looks very similar. The main difference is that garlic mustard is usually found in a very shady place on a forest floor, whereas things like red dead nettle or wild violets tend to be in spaces that are that just have a lot more light. So garlic mustard also, if you crush it in your hands and you sniff it, is going to have a garlicky scent that those other plants are not. But also, if you do mess this one up, red dead nettle is also edible and falls into the category of not necessarily super tasty. I'm not a big bitter green fan. If you are a big bitter green fan, there's a lot out there for you. And then the other way to tell is that the flowers of dead nettle are purple, and the flowers of garlic mustard are white, but by the time that it is flowering, it's probably too bitter to eat. Though you should still rip it out anyway, because garlic mustard is a highly invasive species that's ravaging our forests, and you shouldn't feel bad about taking as much as you want. This next one was one of my first loves of wild edible foods. This grows as a very, very common garden weed. If you are gardening right now in Ohio, you likely have this in your garden right now. I also have an example of this if you want to see a close-up, but it has really, really succulent, beautiful leaves, and it hugs really close to the ground. It tends to lay flat, and it has these like redder, darkish stems. The taste is very much like pepper, lemon, but it's mostly an addition of texture whenever you add it to food. So I love it as like a salad base with just some fruits and cheese and all of that. That one's a fave. I'll say that about every plant. The next one is chickweed, Stellaria media, and it's a good raw salad green. Chickweed was very, very common down in Georgia. I have been trying to find it all day to get an example for y'all, and I have not been as successful, though it does grow here. It's often found, and I found it in Iowa, which is north of here, so you think in the middle I would also, whatever. So it's found in like fields. It'll grow up in between the cracks of sidewalks. It has these opposite leaves, and they kind of all scoop up to look as if there's like this tiny cylinder on the inside. But the best way to tell chickweed is that you can do this pull test, where basically you lightly snap it in half, lightly, and then you pull it apart, and the inside stem is this like really elasticy substance, and so you'll be able to pull it apart, and the outside of the stem will separate as the inside you can still see stretch, which is pretty cool. And then this last one also comes with a story. Before I knew what foraging was, when I was in preschool, I didn't have a dichotomy of like wild versus cultivated food. If something was yummy, it was food. And there were these tiny little yellow flowers that grew along the fence line of the daycare that I went to. And I would just spend all day in daycare just eating those tiny little yellow flowers, every single one I could find. And I was like, yes, 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 every time. And that was oxalis, which I learned about when I was back on the student farm. And I was like, this is the thing. And I ate it. And it was just like one of those things that just the scent and all of it just like, whew, blast to the past. And I was like, this is that thing. And so it's deeply, deeply sentimental. And if you want to taste some, there's a whole bunch growing on those stairs as you walk out. I will point it out to you. I also brought examples of this. Once you pick it, it wilts like super fast. So honestly, we should go check out that as opposed to the ones that I brought. But this whole plant is edible, except for the roots. I don't know if they're like not edible, but I haven't eaten them. I don't know if I would want to. But the seed pods are edible, the yellow flowers are edible and really delicious, and then the leaves are edible. It basically looks like clover, except it has a super intense seam down the middle, and so it'll like fold in half really easily. And also the way that clover sometimes has that like chalky white line that it rounds the halfway point inside. There's clover, just investigate what I'm talking about. And it does not have that. That's another way that you can tell that it's not clover. It's also another one that if you take a little nibble and it doesn't taste lemony and zesty, then you don't have the right thing. So it's a really great addition to, once again, salads. I've used it in desserts. I made like a little icing with it for cupcakes, and that was truly gorgeous with some like strawberry cupcakes. It was so great. But this is one that like you should definitely know because it's a fun one to point out to your friends. And this will grow. This grows literally everywhere. It's in every crack of every sidewalk. It's everywhere that you are. And it's a blessing. Okay, so if you are interested in doing your own foraging, it's hard to retain a lot of information thrown at you at once. So if you want to continue to build skills in this area, I would recommend joining a Facebook group similar to like understanding what's about to be in season, but also just seeing chanterelle after chanterelle after chanterelle after chanterelle in this location, this location, this location, you know, and they're like not the greatest quality photos, but just to see the same species identified as such over and over and over again in all of these different settings gives you a great bouncing off point to be able to like figure out, just to like have more of a body knowledge of like what that would look like. So I would recommend joining a Facebook group. You learn a lot of like really cool things. Definitely check out foraging books. You can get a whole bunch for free from the Columbus Metropolitan Library. They have so many titles. It's very cool. And then I do use an app. It's called Seek. And the thing that I love about Seek is that if Seek does not know what is up, Seek will stop. So oftentimes it'll be like, that is a dicot, and I have no more information for you. And I'm like, thank you so much. But it is really good because I feel like it does help you build confidence in understanding more like family level and genus level things as opposed to just understanding a species. So I feel like I've gotten much more familiar with being able to be like, I have no idea what it is, but it's an aster. And I have no idea what it is, but it's like in this family. It's part of the rose family. And so you can start to build that knowledge, which then will help you recognize other plant groups because most of foraging is plant identification. Which also leads me to, there's a bunch of great books that have kind of like, it's almost like a choose your own adventure, but basically they'll ask you questions that are, you'll have to learn some botanical current terms, but they'll ask you like, are the leaves alternate or are they opposite one another? And then they're like, okay, if so, go to this page. And then they'll ask you another question until you get down to what you're supposed to be looking at. And if it seems wrong, you can like work back a little and work forward. But it starts to really familiarize yourself of like what you need to be looking for when you're looking at plants. And so I always recommend like every once in a while to bring out a good old guidebook and like try your best to parse through just to learn more about like plant anatomy, if not to like best identify the species that's in front of you. And that's, my book recommendations. Backyard foraging is really nice because it breaks things down by season, so you can flip to the season that you're in and start to see what you can start looking for right now. Forage Harvest Feast has a lot of really great berry suggestions, though they're in the Northeast. And then Forager Chef, he has a really great blog that has a lot of really good information and also just like the best foraging recipes that I have found personally. They are so good. And yeah, you can't talk about foraging in Columbus without talking about Alexis Nicole. She is a dream, a doll. Her handle is Black Forager, and she has so much informational content. It is absolutely wild how much she knows. And yeah, she's right here in Columbus, Ohio. So I don't know if she still is. She's gotten very global very quick, but And that's all I have for y'all. If you have any cues, I can take them.